Welcome. I'm Chief Robert Nevarez with the Delano Police Department, and joining me today is Dr. Jana Price-Sharps. Thank you for being here, Dr. Jana Price-Sharps.
Thank you for having me.
And today we're going to be focusing on mental health, specifically for police officers, being that May is National Mental Health Month. And before we get going into the details of this subject, Doctor, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how long you've been involved in this area?
I've been training police officers for 21 years this month, actually.
Wow, that's incredible. And so what got you focused in this area? Because it's kind of a specific area. What got you thinking about this?
About 21 years ago, and I was working in intensive outpatient, working with people that were very depressed and suicidal, and you and I met through a student of mine, and so we started talking, and I did not realize that there was very few services for police officers, and so we started talking about how maybe I could help, and that launched me into a whole new career, which I had no idea that I was being launched into, but I stayed with it because I like it. So.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for that because you have been incredibly helpful. And just a little bit of background, so people may not know about this. Back 21 years ago, I was struggling tremendously. I was a police executive, and on the outside, everything looked good, but I was really struggling with anxiety and depression and panic attacks. And when I started looking for resources, there really wasn't a lot in the Central Valley of California. There was over in the Bay Area down in Southern California, but Central California really didn't have much. In the area that I was looking for, which is more CBT based, and that's when I happened to run into you. And at that point, I just started a peer support group for police officers that were struggling with that, and you were able to step in and help us from a professional standpoint. So that's how Jana and I got to know one another, and we've remained close friends, and we've lectured all over the country on police stress, and I think it's been mutually beneficial. So thank you for your service, Jana. We really do appreciate that. So in your years of experience, what is the most challenging aspect of working with police officers? Because I can speak for myself. I know I'm not the easiest guy to get along with sometimes. So what's been your experience?
You know, I find working with officers is very easy, and I know people might be surprised by that, but police officers are fixers. You know, their whole focus is, okay, what's wrong? What are we going to do to fix it? Let's get moving. And so as far as once they buy into there is ways to fix yourself, there are ways to get better, they move pretty quickly. I think probably the hardest part is dealing with the police officer and the department simultaneously. I think that's probably been the biggest struggle, because what the department needs from the officer may not be what the officer needs right at that moment, you know, and so that just makes it more difficult. It kind of adds a layer.
Do you still find that even though we've done a lot of work in trying to remove the stigma from officers getting help, does that still remain a challenge for police officers, just not wanting anybody to know that they're getting help?
They're all afraid. You know, they're afraid they're going to lose their job. They're afraid of fitness for duty evaluations. They're concerned about losing their livelihood. And so a lot of them don't know the different roles that psychologists may play. And I don't do fitness for duties, but they don't know that. And so understanding the different roles is very helpful. But yes, there's still an enormous stigma. Absolutely.
I know, we're talking about when we first met 20 years ago. I know that it was somewhat challenging for me to try to educate my peers that when an officer was reaching out for help, that was a good thing, that it was time for us to get out of the old way of thinking, which incredibly was more acceptable back then, to drink it off or to be sexually promiscuous as a way of addressing or feeling better related to some kind of sticking point that they might have. Maybe it was PTSD or like I said earlier, anxiety or depression. That was actually more acceptable. That was kind of cool, but incredibly unhealthy. And as a police executive, I know how many careers that I have seen come to an end because of people drinking excessively or workplace inappropriate behavior. I'll leave it at that. And how it was actually a good thing for officers to be reaching out to get professional help so that they can better do the job. That was not an easy thing to broach back then. In fact, I got mocked on occasion by some of those that had been around for a long time, and that's the system that they knew. So, and I'm sure you dealt with it then, and probably still today.
Well, I think mental health treatment is I don't know, kind of been linked to weakness. That if you need to talk to somebody and you're crazy and you're basically should be hospitalized as a 5150 kind of call, and that's not accurate. I mean, I quite frankly, I think everybody should have a therapist that they can just go and kind of process things with every once in a while. And I tell guys I'm a mental chiropractor. Think of me in those terms. When you don't wait until you can't walk to go to the chiropractor. When you start to feel kind of uncomfortable and your back's hurting a little bit, that's when you go to the chiropractor. Same thing with mental health, really.
Yeah, and the way you framed it is real helpful. Early when I was struggling with different things, I went to a variety of different psychologists, and bless all of them because they had an incredible amount of patience dealing with a control freak. As a police officer, it's important that we have control, and as you ascend in an organization, now you're the person responsible for those people that have that control or command presence. And it was really helpful to see people that understood that and would allow me to stay in charge, while the way I kind of saw it, the ones that were most successful were me, with those that kind of linked arms with me and said, here, I'm going to help you along this road, not I'm going to tell you how I'm going to fix you. That just wasn't for me, that wasn't the way I wanted to frame it. Have you felt that with officers?
Very much so. I tell them, look, I can give you some tools, and it's up to you whether or not you use them. But if you want to feel differently, if you want to sleep, if you don't want to have nightmares, if you don't want to have night sweats, if you don't want to be angry at everybody all the time, those things are fixable, but there's some things you need to do, and it's up to you whether you do them. And, I think that one of the things that you did for me, Chief, is that you set me up with mentors, because I told you I don't have any experience with law enforcement, and many of those mentors are still in my life. And so I did a lot of ride-alongs, and I went to a lot of trainings, and I went through Seminitions training, probably 3 or 4 times with your agency, and I went to canine events. And so I started to learn the culture. I started to learn, okay, this is their normal. I think a lot of therapists want to turn the officer into somebody that fits into the civilian world, and that isn't going to happen. And quite frankly, it's dangerous for it to happen when you're a police officer.
Right. And so what you're describing is kind of like with the police and the community. There has to be an element of trust first. Like in our community has to be able to trust us. Without trust, then you see what happens across the country. There's just a lack of ability to get anything accomplished. And it's the same relationship with police and psychologists or the local psychologist community. Officers sometimes see them as a threat because of the things you mentioned earlier. They might have their gun taken away. There might be a fitness for duty evaluation. And I think one of the things that you did that helped you was spending so much time with officers, getting to know them when they didn't need them, so that when something did come up down the road and they were struggling, they hearkened back to that occasion when they interacted with you and you were okay. So maybe it's okay to pick up the phone and call her.
Yes, or anybody else.
Exactly. So you said something earlier, and I want to go back to that. So if somebody's struggling with mental health, anxiety, depression, panic attacks, does that mean they're going crazy?
No.
Explain that a little bit, because I think that's important to cover.
I do too. Most of the time, those things are being driven, at least in the police world, by adrenaline. They don't sleep a whole lot. They don't sleep well. They get exhausted. They're, it, police work is either you're going really, really fast and you're going to high intensity calls, or you're sitting and doing paperwork and you're back and forth a lot of times all night or all day. And so you have all this adrenaline in your system, and then they try and go home and go to bed, and their system is still very amped up. And when you have too much adrenaline over too long a time, people start having panic attacks, and and they start having anxiety. So now they're sleeping even more poorly. And I have found that the number one thing they need to do is sleep. And if they can start getting some sleep, and I call it cooling the system down,
Mm-hmm.
so we can get that adrenaline down a little bit, they start functioning better. And it's either they're going up or they're going down, and
Right.
so helping them to figure out how to cool that system down quickly.
Yeah, that makes sense. And what you described, that adrenalized feeling, there was a lot of symptoms that I was going through back then. Some of them I didn't know what they were, related. Like I remember I didn't have any circulation at the tips of my fingers, and I had my heart rate was elevated all the time. I could feel palpitations and this insomnia. Heck, there was a time where my hair was falling out in clumps. And I'm not a doctor, but I went to a lot of doctors. And what's sad is that back then, I was never diagnosed with having, like I was going through some stressful phase where I wasn't handling it well. And I thought, because of all these things that were happening along with anxiety, depression, which later on turned into really deep depression, I thought I was going crazy. But it's amazing, once I started practicing sound mental health coping techniques, those symptoms started to just fade away. And it's, for me, it just seemed like I was just not handling that dump of adrenaline that was coming into my system on a regular basis very well.
Absolutely.
And do you find that it's common with officers?
Absolutely. The first thing I ask an officer when they come see me is, how are you sleeping? Because that to me is almost a litmus test. Invariably, they come in and they say, oh, 3 or 4 hours a night. Some say I'm sleeping well, and I'm like, okay, well, what does that mean? And I had one guy who literally had not taken days off as far as vacation for 10 years. He was working special units, and he was averaging over a 7-day period about 12 hours of sleep. And he was doing a lot of overtime, and they were doing a lot of different operations, and he was a mess. And I said, there's nothing I can do for you until you sleep, and if you will go sleep, your life is going to get much better. And luckily he had a great sergeant, and I had him call his sergeant right then. I said, I take him off and let him go sleep somewhere. He came back, in about a week, and he was like, wow, I feel so much better. And I'm like, sleep really isn't optional.
Yes, yes. And for police managers, it truly does pencil out for an officer to get plugged into that, because we don't want officers out making decisions under an incredible amount of stress or very little time to determine the avenue, if they're not well rested, because the outcome isn't often what we desire it to be, and it can create a lot of chaos in a community.
Well, and lack of sleep affects all kinds of things, including overall physical health, overall mental health, but it also affects things like, fine motor control and that kind of thing. So it's a mess.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense now, and hopefully there'll be some officers tuning into this, and they'll pick up on that and maybe realize that there's a need to get some outside assistance. So what kind of coping techniques do you believe are most helpful for police officers or anybody else experiencing unhealthy stress?
Well, the first one is get your sleep under control. That's probably the most important one. Uh, so I tell people, have a good sleep routine. Your body and your brain actually releases sleep chemicals about an hour before you go to bed. So start your routine about an hour before you expect to go to sleep. Don't just work up until that point and jump in bed and expect that your body is going to be okay with that. It's not. So sleep time routine, brush your teeth about an hour before you go to bed. So, or whatever you're going to do so that the brain goes, oh, okay, we need to start releasing these chemicals. The other thing I tell people, and especially officers that have so much of adrenaline in their system, is watch something funny before you go to bed. Don't watch the news, for God's sakes. Don't get on the internet and look on Rate Your Cop or whatever horrible websites they go on to. Watch something funny that's going to release some endorphins into your system and some good cooling down neurotransmitters, and do that nightly, and so that your body starts getting used to, okay, this is the time we go to bed. And now that's much more difficult for guys on night shift or gals on night shift, but even then I tell them, try and go to bed about the same time, even though it may be 7 a.m. Try not to shift your system too much on your days off, which I know is asking a lot, but when you're young you can shift back and forth a little bit better, but you get over 30 and it starts really taxing that person. So the number one thing is sleep, making sure you're not drinking a bunch of Red Bull, because of course, you may go to sleep for a few hours, but then you're going to be up because it's still in your system. And taking that time off, taking your vacations. Don't work the long overtime shifts. You can work some overtime, but don't make that a regular thing. Put a little bit here and there, but actually have your time off and cool off during your time off. Go do something fun. Don't just do more work, and so really just kind of taking care of your body. Yes, working out is important, but so is cooling off and having some fun and having some time with your family and taking a trip, going to the beach for a day, whatever you do, but cooling that system down.
That's sound advice, Jana. That's things that I've seen officers that they apply, and I've seen significant changes in officers that were struggling, getting into trouble, and once they finally got plugged into doing things that were balancing to their lives, it's amazing. Their decision making started to improve. It's probably something that you understand very well, but when somebody's in the middle of that forest, they have a hard time navigating through it, and that's why I stress to officers that it's okay to reach out for help. We're not going to judge you. We're not going to make jokes about it like may have happened 25, 30 years ago. It's something that we encourage because we want our officers to be healthy. So I had one last question. What's your experience in the toughest calls that officers handle?
Especially for officers that already have kids, I think the kids' calls are the ones that leave the most horrific impact, or detectives that have worked a lot of like child sex crime calls. But I think the dead child calls or very abused children calls, those seem to stick a long term with the officer. And so those officers that are doing that really need to take good care of themselves. And there is an officer that you and I both know, Chief, that he taught me a lot. And I think one of the best things that he taught me, he's now retired, I call him my FTO, and he told me a story that his initial FTO, so this is spanning back 50 years ago, at the time in the cars they had a button on the by the steering wheel, and they would push that to let dispatch know that they were leaving the call, that the call was resolved. And he said that his FTO told him, every single call you go to, push that button and in your mind and say, this call is now behind me. I'm now going to the next call. He said, do the best job that you can do on that call. And then mentally, even though we no longer have that button, push that button and say, this call has been resolved. It is now behind me. And I think that's really important. I think that unfortunately detectives can't do that as well because they have to be in the midst of all the paperwork and the interviews and the pictures and all of that. So those people really need to find ways to cool their system. And also, I'm going to share this visualization because I use it with many of my officers. If they have a belief system in a higher power, I tell them, if you have somebody that you're concerned about, it's a dead person, it's a dead child, or somebody that's struggling, see God's hands and say, okay, God, they're now yours. Keep them safe, because I can't. I can only do this. I can't keep them safe. And so I think that's really important to do.
Yeah, I agree. Letting it go. In fact, my wife got a picture frame, and it's in essence says, "This is God. You're about to go to bed now. You can give it to me and rest soundly and sleep." And I think that's kind of where you started and where you ended, right? You got to be able to let it go, because if you hang on to it, these mortal shoulders will snap, and that's what can happen if we don't let things go, because we're just human, right?
And you can only do what you can do, and you can do the absolute perfect job and things still go out of control, so the only thing you can do is the best job you can do, and whatever happens beyond that is out of your hands.
Yeah. Yep. Well, Jana, again, I want to thank you for your life's work. You have made a significant difference in my former agency in Fresno and in a lot of other agencies. And I know you also work with firefighters and EMS, and it's something that we're all very thankful to you for doing. So thank you for being part of our podcast, and thank you for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you on our next podcast in this series. Thank you.
And thank you, Chief, for all of your service. You spent many years keeping all of us safe.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you.